Hello, I'm Roger Baker, Executive Director of the Stratfor Center for Applied Geopolitics at RANE. This podcast is brought to you by RANE Worldview, the premier digital publication for objective geopolitical intelligence and analysis. Find out how RANE can help you stay ahead of global events at ranenetwork.com.
This is RANE's Essential Geopolitics podcast, your go-to source for quick and reliable geopolitical intelligence. I'm Emily Donahue. Welcome aboard. Every year, the Central Asia country of Kazakhstan celebrates its Independence Day, marking its separation from the Soviet Union. It was the last former Soviet republic to do so. But since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, there's evidence, or perhaps rumors, that Kazakhstan is concerned about its relationship with Russia. Matthew Orr has all the details. He's a Eurasia analyst with RANE. Matthew, it's great to have you back.
Hey, Emily, it's great to be here.
Is it true that the relationship between Russia and Kazakhstan may be worsening?
Well, the short answer is that there's a lot of evidence to suggest that something like that is taking place, but on the other hand, no real degradations of relations have taken place. So what do I mean by that? Well, if you just look at some of the events that have taken place in bilateral relations since the invasion, there's a lot of evidence suggests that tensions between Russia and Kazakhstan are growing quite significantly. This kind of all hit the Western headlines when Kazakhstan's president, Tokayev, actually told Putin to his face at the St. Petersburg Economic Forum that Kazakhstan would not recognize the independence of Russia's quasi-independent republics in Ukraine, and Kazakhstan has continued to maintain that position and does not recognize Russia's actions in Ukraine. But really, there had been other signs. So, as far back as March, Kazakhstan had started to remove pro-Russian symbols from public spaces, things with like the V and the Z, these letters that had become kind of pro-Russian symbols. There was also the traditional May 9th victory parade in Almaty in Kazakhstan was actually canceled. A lot of people believe that was related to Kazakhstan not wanting to show itself to be, tying itself so deeply into these symbols that Russia sees as kind of the symbols of close alignment with Moscow and Moscow's version of history. But then kind of the more significant signs really began to pick up. The biggest was that there's actually been 4 shutdowns of the CPC pipeline, the Trans-Caspian pipeline that takes Kazakh oil, the vast majority of Kazakhstan's oil out of the country. That pipeline has experienced 4 shutdowns this year, all of which were unplanned essentially, and essentially on dubious grounds. And those are just some of the factors that have led us to believe that Kazakhstan's relations with Russia are worsening. But on the other hand, Kazakhstan, remains closely tied with Russia. It continues to sign agreements on future cooperation with Russia. And Kazakhstan's president called Putin, I think, first of all foreign leaders after he announced that he would basically change the constitution and run for a 7-year term on November 20th, so just about a month from now. So there's still all these signs that Kazakhstan's president remains very close to Russia, and Russia doesn't seem particularly concerned about Kazakhstan at this time, or at least that's the signals that they're sending, that Tokayev very much remains Moscow's guy, so to speak.
So, Matthew, what is each side seeking from the relationship? Like, what are the Kremlin's goals in Kazakhstan, and are they attainable on the world stage, I should say?
Yeah, so Russia's most ambitious goals with regard to Kazakhstan would be to make Kazakhstan into something like what Russia's done to Belarus, where Belarus is essentially entirely dependent on Russia economically, and now essentially in so many other ways as Russia and Belarus integrate in this entity called the Union State. In an ideal world, Russia would probably want Kazakhstan to be similarly close to Russia economically, legally, politically, of course, integrated with Russia, its policies, etc. But I think the Kremlin likely realizes that at least in the near to midterm, that goal is pretty is pretty optimistic, particularly amid Russia's war in Ukraine, right, which is drawing all of Russia's resources and is provides a very clear economic reason for a country like Kazakhstan to actually distance itself from Russia and instead integrate with other regional friends and allies, as it's done, including countries like China and Turkey. President Tokayev has actually had the leaders of China and Turkey visit his country in the months since the invasion, and those visits were accompanied by not only concrete agreements about investment and economic cooperation, but also Tokayev stressing his close personal ties to these leaders. He awarded President Xi Kazakhstan's highest award, and actually awarded the Turkish president Erdogan a similar award. So it's quite clear that Kazakhstan is pushing back against kind of close alignment with Russia, at least now. The other thing I would like to point out is that Kazakhstan maintains what it calls its multi-vector foreign policy, which basically aims to develop ties with all of its regional kind of partners and allies, and not to become too focused on one single kind of foreign policy direction. The policy has long been interpreted in Russia as a way for Kazakhstan to, justify not becoming more deeply integrated with Russia, and that foreign policy is kind of the pillar of a lot of kind of Kazakh policy. It's essentially Tokayev's domestic reforms are often framed as intended to preserve that foreign policy, hinting at the prospect of becoming more deeply integrated with Russia, if the country's internal stability cannot be maintained. So I think all of that makes a picture where Kazakhstan's policy can be summed up like something like the following. It's that you want to keep your friends close, so Kazakhstan's friends are countries like China and Turkey, but it wants to keep its enemies closer, namely Russia, because it knows that if it publicly makes too much distance from Moscow, then Moscow is quite likely to resort to coercion or possibly even force military action to ensure that Kazakhstan remains more closely aligned with Russia.
Did I not read that Kazakhstan's leader said when men were leaving Russia to avoid being called up that they were welcome there?
Yes, they did. I should have mentioned that in the first part. So this is another one of the long list of ways that Kazakhstan has rankled Moscow. So Kazakhstan is increasingly the destination for Russians who are fleeing Russia's mobilization, including many kind of fairly wealthy Russians, people from the middle class, highly educated people, programmers, IT people, things of that sort. And so, yeah, obviously, Kazakhstan, opening its doors to those people essentially allows the Kremlin to claim that Kazakhstan is becoming a bastion for forces that are not aligned with Russian interests. So yes, it's another one of these ways that Kazakhstan is trying to exert its influence and create a broader space for an independent policy, precisely because Russia is currently tied up in Ukraine and not able to respond more with escalatory or retaliatory action against Kazakhstan.
Well, would Russia consider military action against Kazakhstan, considering everything that you've mentioned?
Yes, I think that it would, although we have to very clearly caveat this, that this is, at this time, an extremely remote possibility. This is more something that is a possibility many years down the line, and particularly in a case where Russia is able to end the war in Ukraine on terms that are more or less favorable and avoid long-term instability in Russia. In a scenario like that, Moscow could very easily turn eastward and say to Kazakhstan, well, look, you really tried to stress your independence and move away from us when we were in a difficult moment, but now that we are, our resources are freed up, we're going to begin focusing our integration efforts down in your direction. And if Kazakhstan doesn't get the message and doesn't comply and voluntarily, begin to integrate more deeply with Russia, then of course it would threaten something like this. But this is notable even because I think that before the invasion of Ukraine and before the events of the last several months, a Russian invasion of Kazakhstan was just a very theoretical possibility. Now this has gone from a merely theoretical possibility to something that is, albeit unlikely and quite remote, but something that actually is a possibility in the coming years, particularly also if Kazakhstan is not able to maintain internal stability, as we saw in January of this year when mass protests swept Kazakhstan. Russia, quite notably, led its alliance, the CSTO, to send troops to Kazakhstan to calm the situation. So Russia has already begun to cultivate this precedent that it can use its military forces to intervene in internal Kazakh affairs. And so I think that while this is not something that we currently think is really possible, it's definitely something that we're going to be tracking for the coming years of how does Kazakhstan preserve its independence in the face of a Russia that has now shown itself to be willing to use force at extremely high cost in order to ensure that countries that it sees in its orbit remain closely aligned or at least constrained.
Matthew Orr is RANE's Eurasia analyst. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you so much, Emily.
His analysis appears in RANE Worldview, the risk intelligence app for professionals, and in our consumer publication, which offers objective geopolitical analysis and intelligence covering the global landscape. You can find out more about RANE Worldview at ranenetwork.com. That's RANE network.com. I'm Emily Donahue, and as always, thank you for listening.